Folks, my name is Colonel Wilcox, and I'm the president and the commanding officer of the Villanova NROTC unit, and also the commanding officer of the University of Pennsylvania NROTC unit, hence why we have students from both schools. I also teach a class called Leadership and Ethics, and I made a deal with my students. I told them that if they came to the conference, they didn't have to take their midterm. So that's why you see a lot of them. But I got to tell you, pulling a fire alarm during an exam is the oldest trick in the book. I'm on to it. So I know that's where it was. Somewhere over there, someone out there said we can get out of this by pulling the fire alarm. Anyways, I'm the moderator for the next session. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Karen Greenberg. She's the Director and Center of National Security at Fordham Law School. Dr. Greenberg is the author, co-author, and editor of 5 to 6 books and is widely cited as a leading expert in national security and terrorism. She holds a BA in History from Cornell and a PhD in History from Yale, and she's a permanent member of the Council of Foreign Relations. The respondent from West Point is Major Ian Fishback, and frankly, Major Ian Fishback and myself have been in a couple of these type of conferences at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Major Fishback is a Special Forces officer and now instructor at West Point. He holds a master's degree in philosophy and is working towards his PhD. The respondent from Villanova is Dr. Peter Bush, who's a professor here at Villanova and a Lawrence Gallon Fellow Augustine Cultural Seminar visiting professor and a political theorist. Sorry, Professor, but there wasn't much information on you that I was given. No problem. Dr. Greenberg?
So, hi. I've been apprised that the mics, can you hear me? Okay. I'm not going to worry about it. So I've been speaking a lot about drones, and so I guess today I was going to talk a little bit about drones, and I know you guys have read my paper that's about to be published on drone warfare. But I was thinking about this conference today, and part of this is inspired by hearing the comments of the earlier session, some of which covered what's in that paper. And I thought I would talk about, in this notion of war and ethics, to try to place for you the way I see what has happened to the concept of war since the beginning of the war on terror. And what I would like to introduce to the conversation is a piece of this that lies in the background, but is very much the focus of the things I think about, which is how the various components of the attack against the enemy have worked together to redefine war, to institutionalize principles of war, and to do so outside of the military sphere. Because in fact, that's what I think has happened to war. I think it has become institutionalized in a way that it no longer belongs exclusively, and sometimes no longer belongs in any way, to the military. And you can make your own ethical and moral judgments about that. So that's the end. So now, so what I'm going to do is contextualize how I think this happened over time. And some of this you'll know, but I think put in the larger framework, it'll be a little more thought-provoking for you. I want to bring you back to September 11th and to the night that President Bush addressed the nation, which was, I'm sure, one of the more difficult things that any president has had to do. That speech is worth rereading. It's very short, and it is very to the point, and it is completely predictive of what happened. He refers to the war on terrorism immediately in his speech, and he refers to the war as a moral war. It is a war between evil and terrorists. I mean, between evil, who are the terrorists, and freedom, which is the United States. Freedom and the United States as a beacon of freedom, as well as the possessor of freedom. He sets it out in an ethical, moral tone from the very beginning. And that has everything to do with what happens. In that speech, he also delineates who's going to lead this war on terror. He doesn't say the military, and part of that is to cover himself and to wait until the authorization for the use of military force is passed 3 days later. And I think it was probably a wise political move in that respect, because they were already drafting it. And they released it to the Congress on September 12th. But it's not. That's not the only reason. What he does is he says, in order to get justice in this new conflict, in this war on terrorism, we're going to turn to law enforcement and to our intelligence communities. And in fact, that's very much what happened. And where do the law enforcement and the intelligence communities meet, and where did they continue to meet throughout the war on terror, which involved the military? I'm not saying it didn't. But the other components where the intelligence community, in a way, had never been involved before, the expansion of the intelligence community, and the Department of Justice, which is where the law enforcement component lay. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but I'll talk to you about the different layers in which this happened. As you probably know, several days later, no, actually 1 day later, George Bush called a meeting in the White House, and he assembled his national security team, the military, the intelligence communities, Justice Department, including the FBI, et cetera. And he looked at them, and he looked around the room, and he said, I charge you with making sure this never happens again. I charge you with what David Luban has just called the preventive model for what's going to happen. And you know who he pointed to? He could have pointed to somebody at the Joint Chiefs. He could have pointed to Donald Rumsfeld. He could have pointed to George Tenet. He didn't. He pointed to John Ashcroft, who is the head of the Department of Justice, and who understood the moral and what he thought ethical component of the war on terror, as well as anybody in Washington. And this is where it began. And what happened, I think you know, but I will go through it. What happened was that the Department of Justice did rethink its mission in a number of above-board ways. And they tackled 3 issues. One of the issues was detention. One of the issues was interrogation. One of the issues was surveillance. And they attacked them in ways that understood that they had to revise set guidelines, that they had to go to Congress and get the Patriot Act passed with authorities that they needed to have, be able to combat al-Qaeda and other terrorists around the world, associated terrorists. They knew that they had to revise, in particular, the surveillance powers. And by the way, when they write the history of the war on terror, they're not going to be paying attention to the things I've been consumed with for 10 years. They're going to focus on how much was about surveillance powers. It's extraordinary as it comes to light, something I think we all bear some responsibility for not paying more attention to. And so over the course of the next 6 months, there was a series of legislative proposals put forth, written by the Department of Justice. You know the Patriot Act, but there were many others that over maybe 18 months and through a number of court procedures and legislative acts transformed what the law could do to get the enemy, to do what the military used to do, and what the military was about to do in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. But it wasn't enough. And so the counterterrorism model, the war on terror, was never a war that was attached just to violence the way you might define war in a traditional sense. And I think this speaks to some of the questions that came up in the last session. As much as this above-board proactive reform was going on to make sure that there could be wider surveillance with lower thresholds of legal authorities, that there could be public safety exceptions for things like Miranda rights, that there could be a detention policy that would be free of what had been attached to the laws of war. There was another, as you know, secret Department of Justice strategy taking place, which had to do with the writing of secret memos. And those secret memos have everything to do with how this country fought the war. And to pretend that we can just talk about war outside of this component is to blind our eyes to what really happened. What happened in those memos, which affected the intelligence community, the military, and the judicial system, was that massive surveillance, warrantless massive surveillance, mass surveillance on Americans as well as foreigners was allowed. But by September 25th, the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel had written a memo penned by John Yoo, which said that because the United States, after September 11th, was in a new place. The calculus had to be redefined. The calculus had to be redefined. It had shifted. Those were John Yu's words. And in every memo he wrote after that, he referred to that sense that the calculus had shifted. What had shifted? War was now in the hands of civilian institutions. War could now mean that the laws themselves not could change, but better change, because without it, the country wouldn't be safe. And so those memos, as you know, led to redefining the enemy. And the most significant way the enemy was redefined was the creation of a new category of enemy combatant. And while in the war sphere, this is very interesting in terms of how it affects the application of the Geneva Conventions and other things, it was immediately important in the United States for American citizens. Because individuals who were arrested, like Jose Padilla most notably, for being suspects of wanting to foment terrorist attacks in the United States were taken out of the civilian courts in which they had been indicted, in which he had been indicted, and put into military custody. Padilla was kept in military custody for several years before the civilian court system set him back. So to say that the war model only applies to violence and to what's happening abroad doesn't really get to the point of what it means to bring the war home, to take the war back to yourself. So that's one way, was the enemy combatant status. The second way I've already mentioned, which was the mass surveillance that was allowed by that first memo. And then, of course, the detention authorities that were given to Guantanamo, by which I mean the notion of indefinite detention, which would be without trial, and without release until the end of hostilities. So this is the paradigm. It is the full war paradigm, and it includes what happened in the United States within the legal system, both the legal things that happen within the legal system and the illegal things that happened within the legal system. And it's important for you to understand this in the context of what is happening right now. Towards the end of the Bush administration, a number of the more prominent lawyers inside, some of whom were new, some of whom had been there the entire time, some of whom had been in the Office of Legal Counsel, convinced the president to change course and succeeded in getting most of the memos that I've referred to repealed. At the same time, there were a number of revelations of what had happened in terms of torture, as you know, enhanced interrogation techniques, and in terms of the surveillance authorities that had been used against Americans, massively, broadly, and who knows what was happening with the information. Those in the Department of Justice who worked for the Bush administration and those lawyers who were general counsels at a number of the agencies, including the CIA and the NSA, a number of them, and the FBI, were convinced that these were illegal policies. And as you know, the memos were struck down, and by the end of the Bush administration, much of the course had been set for what we've seen in the Obama administration. But what those lawyers found out, and what the Obama administration has found out, is that once you start in a certain direction, it is extremely hard to reverse course. And so here Obama was coming into office within the middle of a war that has not ceased, that was a hot war, and that he had promised to get out of. And he would run on the platform that, if anything else, he wanted to reverse the illegalities of the war on terror. So as you know, he came into office on day one. He issued 3 national security executive orders to end torture, to close Guantanamo, and to come up with a viable and legal detention policy. That was his intention. The problem was that, forgetting the illegal authorities, the legal authorities, that didn't seem so bad compared to the illegal authorities that had been devised by the Department of Justice and then by Congress, or existed. They were codified and already had been somewhat under President Bush. The first of these, and the most significant of these, is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. which had been struck down. As you know, the New York Times held on to the story for 18 months because the administration asked them to. By the time the information came out, the United States was already so deep, this is an interpretation, so deep into this war that just ending the program wasn't viable. It wasn't like torture. George Bush could get up in front of the nation and say, yes, we had a program, yes, I stand by it, yes, it worked, and we're not going to do it anymore. Or at least we're going to pull back on it to the point where it's not going to be a policy like we've had it before. That was in fall of 2006. But with surveillance policy and with detention policy, it was another matter. And slowly over the course of time, what has happened is that what was established by those illegal memos in the name of war to counter the enemy as a counterpart to the military became part of the American system. And the image of America, who America is in the world. And so this may sound like, really boring when you hear the word FISA or FISA Amendments Act or Protect America Act, your just eyes glaze over. It's too bad. They should have given them better names because your eyes should not glaze over. This was taking the authorities for massive surveillance and legalizing them through the Congress, legalizing them on a different level through the secret court of the FISA court, and therefore it is the law of the land. It is the law of land and it is the practice of the land, and it is done in order to defeat the enemy. And even if you end the war and you end the hostilities, these remain. The same thing with the indefinite detention policy. Bush administration did not pull back on the indefinite detention policy, and neither did the Obama administration. Although he made these decrees to come up with a viable detention policy and close Guantanamo in January of 2009, by May, in his archive speech, the president had decided that that indefinite detention was going to be likely part of his program. And it has been, and it remains that way. When he says he is going to close Guantanamo, he does not mean, and has never indicated that he means, that he will end the indefinite detention policy. He has, on occasion, made it clear that if some of the individuals in indefinite detention at Guantanamo, upon their periodic review, no longer seem to be dangerous, that that category could be whittled down. But mark my words, Guantanamo will close. I bet it closes at the end of this presidency, and it will not mean the end of indefinite detention. Indefinite detention will remain. So it's been a hard thing. Once you start in a certain direction, no matter how illegal it is to start with, you say that this is in the name of national security, you tie this to your war effort, you make it so that the war can go away, but the war at home stays, and you have yourself a problem. And this is what I call the problem of permanent war, which we are in. Now, this is how we got to the drone policy. Because the drone policy, which I know fluttered in and out of the conversation ahead of time. What is the drone policy? The drone policy is the use of unmanned aerial vehicles that are used for targeted killings in countries either in the hot zone, as David Luban referred to, or in other countries that are associated forces with Al-Qaeda. They are seen to be authorized under the authorization for the use of military force. All this is under dispute, and the reason everybody's focused on this right now in this national security field is that can you still do drone strikes after the war, the hot war in Afghanistan ends? And the legal community and the policy community is somewhat split on this. The national security establishment isn't really that split on it. They're going to continue these drone strikes. Why? Because the drone strikes are the logical culmination of what it means to have a permanent war. And if you have a permanent war that you're already conducting in the matters of surveillance, in the matters of detention, you need a military component. It's a three-part system, and it's been that way from day one. And the military component will be, for the most part, drone warfare. Now, somebody brought up viscera and numbers. No one can tell you authoritatively how many people have been killed by drone strikes. That in and of itself should tell you something. Bush launched 50 and that's probably a generous number, an exaggerated number, 50 drone strikes. President Obama has launched at least 300, killing, and I'm picking the lowest number possible, killing 3,000 individuals. They can't all be operational leaders. Trust me. That, you know, give me any map of Al-Qaeda and chart of Al-Qaeda, there were not 3,000, let alone 4,700, which is Lindsey Graham's estimate, of people who've been targeted by drone strikes. What is the rationale for drone strikes? The rationale for drone strikes is it is a just war. It does fit your just war theory. What the Obama administration has said, and just to be clear, the Obama administration has never talked about the legal authorities for the drone policy. They have talked about the legal authorities for targeting an American citizen and explained it in that context. And that has been taken by the rest of us, because we don't have anything else, to stand for the whole policy. But there are many in the administration who will tell you they're not the same thing. So who knows? Someday we may know the full extent of the rationale for the policy. And I think you heard somewhat about this in the earlier session. But one of the reasons for the drone policy is that it's considered to be humanitarian. It's humanitarian in the way that it saves lives. Mostly, it saves American lives. It keeps boots on the ground from being on the ground. It keeps troops out of harm's way. The collateral damage and those numbers of thousands of deaths is considered to be very high even today. So the name targeted killing is actually somewhat duplicitous, to pick a kind term. These are not targeted killings. They want to be targeted killings, though. They're want to be targeted killings, and sometimes they do get their target, by the way. That doesn't mean they get their target and anybody else is standing around the target. But they're considered to be humanitarian from a larger point of view, which is, you want a full-scale war? You want another Afghanistan? You want to be killing people in Afghanistan, in Iraq? You want to be losing American lives? So it's considered the least bloodshed possible given a war situation. President Obama is not a president who doesn't like war. And again, that's kind of euphemistic. In the fall of 2009, he accepted, as you know, the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. And what did he say when he accepted the Peace Prize? He said, war is necessary for peace. And he referred to just war theory. And he talked about what it meant to have to be the nation who stands at the center of the world as the possessor of the rights and liberties of the globe, and to have to wage this just war through drones. And it was rather staggering, I think, to everybody who heard this speech, that anybody would accept the Nobel Peace Prize and talk about war. He has never backed away from the idea of war and warfare. And I venture to say that he means it on all these different levels that I've referred to, because none of these policies have ended, with the exception of torture, which was immediately ended, have ended under Obama. In fact, as I said before, but I want to reiterate, they became law. But George Bush, in his administration, would refer to many of these things and to the secret memos as emergency strategies. But you know, actually, they were emergency strategies then. But as this war goes on and on and on, and as the hot war becomes what's the opposite of, it's not a Cold War, a war that is a diaspora war all over the globe, it is a permanent war. And the thing about this permanent war that is so interesting, or there are a number of things. The first is that Jay Johnson, who is now the Department of Homeland Security head, who was the general counsel at the Defense Department, referred to this war as important, and what Obama had done, whom he served, as important because it moved the war away from the United States. It took the war to them. I think that's right. This war is not here the way it was perceived to be here on 9/11 and immediately after 9/11. But the rest of the war, the authorities for war, the things we do at home to fight this war are very much still here. The drone policy is what Obama sees as the way forward to to continue the permanent state of warfare, to keep the military arm of war going, to counter the enemy, but it's not the most important part of what he sees as this war. It is just another piece. And it is a piece that is very easy to reckon with because it doesn't touch Americans. It doesn't touch us. Yes, it may touch a rogue American who's out in the field who gets, who for one reason or another, the administration thinks they can't bring into the justice system and they can't capture, and so they kill him as an enemy or an enemy combatant or whatever they want to kill him as. But the fact is that the rest of this war is very much in American hearts and in American minds. And this is something I'd like to talk to you about, so and I hear we are slow on time, so I'm not going to say that much more, but I do want to say that there was something very interesting about what President Obama said when he accepted the Peace Prize, because he really did want to explain this in humanitarian terms. He did not talk about the blowback that could come from being a presence around the world for this long. He did not talk about the blowback of what would turn out to be his drone program, which, for all of the worries about how torture in Guantanamo would cause hate for America around the world, this drone policy is hurting us everywhere. This war, and this permanent war that we're about to enter, is hurting us everywhere, and mostly, I might add, among our European allies these days. Our surveillance programs are hurting us everywhere here, and they are hurting us with our European allies. So what did Obama say when he accepted the Peace Prize? He said he wanted to explain how he understood war, as long as he was going to talk about it in these circumstances, because he understood the magnitude of what he was saying, I believe. When you accept the Nobel Peace Prize and you talk about war, what you're really saying is that we're partners. War and peace are partners, and I'm going to make sure that happens, thinking that the drone policy could replace so much of the violence and bloodshed and political mess that had come before. But what he actually said was, war is an expression of human feelings. And what I find most interesting about this is that what he's actually done with his drone program, which is the linchpin of his permanent state of war that now has all these legal authorities that are no longer secret bestowed upon it, is to make sure, absolutely sure, that war is absolutely without human feelings from our side. Those are my remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Greenberg. And now for a respondent from the Military Academy, Major Fishbeck.
So this is a little bit less focused on drones than I originally envisioned, but that's a good thing, actually, because as I read the paper, I thought the problem was actually a lot broader, so you just made it broader, so that's good. I'm going to get the quotes wrong because I don't remember them, but verbatim, but I get the gist of them. If you go back to some of the famous quotes that we will recite in our national mythology, you have things like, "Give me liberty or give me death." You have things like Ben Franklin saying something akin to, "The person who is willing to trade their freedom for security deserves neither and will have neither," or something like that. Anyway, the basic premise is, hey, if you're not willing to stand up for your liberty, if you're willing to trade that in order to get security, then you don't really belong in a democracy anyway. But if you turn to the Federalists and what they wrote, it's very clear that their tone is something more akin of, well, if we don't achieve security, liberty is not going to survive anyway. So it's just a lost cause. Their view of human nature is, look, if you're relying on human virtue to stand up for liberty in the face of security threats, you're just mistaken as an empirical matter. And they'll say things like, well, we can be that virtuous. We can achieve that level of virtue, and we need some level of virtue. But if you're just relying on civic virtue to maintain your liberty, then it's not sustainable. And as I look at the problem over the last 10 years, that's really the lens through which I look at the war on terrorism. And it's true. The protracted aspect of the war is this permanent war. That's the true danger of what we're in right now. What type of nation are we going to become? What type of people are we going to become? It's not just about survival. It's about surviving as the type of people we want to be. And so that's one aspect that comes out. When you start blending Department of Justice with what we used to call the Department of War, but now we call the Department of Defense, that is problematic in a republic, in a democracy. So that aspect is dangerous to us. And it's good that it's not as secret as it used to be. Now it's more transparent. But it's still very dangerous. The other aspect of the problem, which I'm going to focus on more as a matter of degree, is what do we do? So I caught a lot of Audrey Cronin in your piece, which is like, hey, the cost of drone strikes are long-term protracted warfare. We're going to metastasize al-Qaeda. So we're looking at this threat from al-Qaeda. It's a permanent threat to our security. What would happen if a nuclear weapon went off in the United States? What would happen if a biological weapon went off in the United States? It would seriously undermine security, and if we take the Federalists seriously, it would probably endanger liberty over the long run, because unless we're more virtuous than we seem to be, a lot of people are going to be willing to give up liberties in order to secure themselves from those threats. So we have to deal with those threats. We can't just stop doing drone strikes and say, well, al-Qaeda will go away. We have to do something. And that's the problem. And I actually look at the way we've tried to deal with these problems from a little bit longer perspective. I go back to the Cold War and how we would deal with problems in foreign countries during the Cold War. What we did in the Cold War is we would say, all right, that's fine. You guys don't like the United States. Well, we're just going to establish a dictator. They're going to pretty much rule you. They're going to be the sovereign, the Hobbesian sovereign, and they're going to terrorize you. And I can deal with the dictator. The U.S. government can deal with the dictator. I mean, Saddam Hussein. Who supported Saddam Hussein? We did. And the long-term problem with that is you metastasize al-Qaeda, right? Later down the road, the people who were the subject of these dictators realized that that happened through the powers of the United States, and they blame, rightfully, the United States. So then we come out of September 11th, and one of the lessons that we supposedly learn is, well, that model doesn't work. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to spread democracy. And we're going to try to create liberal institutions. We're going to take away Hobbes and we're going to give him Locke, basically. Well, that was kind of freaking hard. I mean, looking back on the last 12 years, that didn't work out so well, and it was extremely expensive. Perhaps so expensive that if we tried to do it over prolonged periods of time, we would actually impoverish ourselves to the point where we'd endanger national security. Maybe. It's really hard to tell, because if you give a drunken fool a task and he does a really poor job, you can't really tell whether the task was impossible. This war was prosecuted so poorly that I'm not sure we can draw those types of lessons. But it's clear that we didn't accomplish it, and it wasn't for a lack of resources. We were willing to commit plenty of resources. If we can't establish liberal democracies and terrorism metastasizes the problem, what do we do? What do you do about al-Qaeda? I don't buy the idea that al-Qaeda is just they're not a threat anymore. They're just gonna go away. Like, if you don't suppress the threat, it's gonna materialize in actual terrorist attacks. And some of those could be catastrophic. I actually think the answer lies in numbers. Someone said earlier that this is a visceral thing. It is a visceral thing, but it's also a black hole that's studyable. Studyable, there's a nice word. It can be analyzed. You can use political science to figure out what works and what doesn't in these situations. And we're doing a really poor job of it, okay? one of the reasons we're doing a really poor job of it, I'm not sure how much more time do I have? One of the reasons we're doing a really poor job of it is because of secrecy. The drone strikes, torture, any other controversial tactic that we've used happens behind a veil of secrecy that really hinders our capability to figure out whether or not it even works. When Dick Cheney gets up and says, well, torture works, I can vouch for it. I'm sorry, I don't trust you. That's not data that I can receive and say, oh, well, in that case, we should do this policy. But nobody presents any data, so we're left basically arguing with each other over whether an empirical fact is true or not, and we have no way of verifying it. And people justify their policies behind the veil of secrecy. I've been behind the veil of secrecy. I know that at least 50% of the time the veil of secrecy is used to justify things that don't work, to make bosses look better than they really ought to, etc., than it is to actually protect some kind of national security interest. That's dangerous. So we need to be as transparent as possible. In terms of the drone strikes, I think we need to try to develop some kind of transparency with the people we're killing. So if you're killing Afghanis and Pakistanis, you need to achieve some degree of transparency with them. And one thing we don't talk about a lot that I think we need to talk about is there needs to be a feedback mechanism for those people. Like right now, you can write your congressman, you can write your senator. Somebody in Pakistan or Afghanistan, what do they have to do? They can go to the ground force commander. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've had foreigners break down in tears merely because I listened to them. Okay? Think about that. How broken is the system if after 8 years of war they get a commander who just listened to them? I didn't even necessarily act. I just listened. And how is a system that is that deaf to the concerns of the people that are being harmed possibly going to function in any way that instills some sense of order and peace and stability and self-policing amongst those people? I just think it's impossible. I think that's the key to finding a middle ground between a policy of terrorism and a policy of trying to create liberal institutions in kind of a very idealistic, hyper-naive fashion. There's got to be a middle ground where we create some kind of feedback mechanism that's not liberal democracy, but allows the people who live where we're dropping the bombs to have a voice in what's being done. So that's my response.
Dr. Bush, you're next.
Well, I'm also going to respond to the fact that that her spoken remarks were a little different from, or had a different emphasis than the paper. But as long as I'm transparent and legal in how I move about and don't proceed with too much secrecy, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I'm also not planning on attacking because I got an awful lot out of the original paper as well as your comments just now. There was something in comparing the two that I found to be interesting, and I'll take as my point of departure. The paper focuses on blowback. How the policy of drones will in the longer term be counterproductive, even if in the short term there are gains to be had from being able to kill lots of combatants without putting any boots on the ground. So to have a month when there were no casualties, that's amazing, and it hasn't happened for a long time. That we've been able to shift in the direction of drones has to be credited, at least partly, for this advantage. So there have been short-term gains, but the long-term interest is not with the policy of drones. That was much of the thrust of the original paper. And in the end, she also meant to raise some fundamental questions, which she touched on in her spoken remarks, about what does this policy of drone warfare mean for the very meaning of war? Will the very distinction between war and peace become more and more blurred as time goes on? And don't we have to confront that question in order to be able to deal with other certainly important questions like whom are we allowed to target with our strikes and so on? So through her argument of the paper, she was very, as she put it in the end, pragmatic, or to use a common IR term, realistic in the kind of argument she was making. But in reading the paper, I wondered about this, but I did suspect in the end that it's not necessarily an expression of where her heart was. And that she thought that it was somehow important to make the argument in this way. And so a question that I would have for her, but I really would be for everyone in the room, is that the best way to try to gain some kind of control over this metastasizing policy, which is perhaps leading to metastasizing problems, to make realistic arguments and to convince people in that way? Your spoken remarks were very passionate. They were clearly morally grounded, but I think they also helped me to understand better, perhaps, why you made your argument in the way you did in your paper. So I'll try to make some suggestions in answer to my own question, but I hope you'll correct me and elaborate as needed. In the original paper, and even more in your comments, it was clear that a certain kind of dependence on law, a certain kind of appeal to moral laws, a certain kind of humanitarianism makes things much worse. It's one thing to have emergency measures. It's another thing to put these emergency measures into law, to codify them into law. And then you find many years later that that the laws of the land are carrying us forward down a path that we really shouldn't be on. Similarly, to be able to call a policy which is horrible in many ways humanitarian, if you can put it in these clothes and even believe that it's humanitarian, then again it's going to be harder to gain control of it. So perhaps the thought is, and there may well be something to this, that thinking in terms of interests, thinking pragmatically, realistically, may actually help in comparison with a false pragmatism, a false moralism or false humanitarianism. And so I would leave it at that general suggestion, but I would be interested in your further comments about that. I was struck in the paper, you included the quote in the paper about war as an expression of human feelings. And I have to say that that's just one of the most hideous things I've ever heard. There are times when I haven't necessarily thought that much was wrong with Obama, or that he was trying to do good things, but confronting those words again is just, there's something really, really wrong about it, about the political perspective that's expressed in that way. At the very least, the human feelings being expressed would be squeamishness, which is not necessarily where statesmanship comes from. I would have some questions in the end to ask, for all of us, but particularly for our speaker. Would it have been better then to stick to emergency measures? Could one have avoided emergency measures in the weeks after 9/11? Could one really have proceeded after 9/11 without some kind of step up in surveillance and detentions just to find out what's going on? And depending on circumstances, one might draw back quickly from it, or not, depending if one finds that that the problem is really very pervasive. Could one have proceeded very differently from what the Bush administration did, at least in the early weeks? But would it have been better to avoid codifying it in law for the reasons that you state? Is there something more genuinely ethical in a valuable way? You stressed that there was a moral ethical component to the Bush administration's response from the start. Was that a good thing? But the problem is when you try to call down the authority of natural law and just war theory in order to place the stamp of approval on a policy that has been going on for years. It seems to me that we may have to allow statesmanship a certain flexibility to respond to circumstances. But the problem is that when you have emergency circumstances come up, the choices that you end up making then continue to haunt you afterwards. The question I would like to leave you with is, can we really have it any other way? Thank you.
No one will accuse any three of you of being long-winded, so thank you for being punctual. We'll open the floor for questions now, please. And I'm going to ask you to use this. Questions? Right there in the back.
Andrew Beckman, West Point. Now to address the idea of maybe using special forces, special operations instead of drone strikes, and how that might be different legally and morally in continuing war.
That's a great question. I have to tell you that that's a great question. That actually, a friend of mine is a major special forces person, and it makes the case now. Can you hear me?
I'll throw something back there.
A good friend of mine is a former Pentagon official and a long-standing, many decades special forces person, who makes the argument that, that special forces allow this, he wouldn't say it like this, but I hear it like this, would allow this space between full-out warfare, and more the targeted killing. Yeah, it could. It doesn't get around the fact of understanding, and it doesn't require any new legal authorities. And I think you're raising another point, which is not exactly a special forces point, but it's the point about, it touches on the secrecy issue in a very uncomfortable way, which is so much of what's been done in this war was taking what had been covert and making it overt. What I see the special forces as doing is sort of reconstituting what used to be lean, focused, legal, but doesn't have to be voted on by all of Congress, and isn't secret. At the same time, isn't secretive. So I think it's an alternative measure to a lot of things, not necessarily just to drones. It's something worth thinking about. But again, there's probably no Band-Aid for what we've already done.
I also have a few friends in special forces. I think it's important to make a distinction between special operations and special forces. So if you're talking about SEAL Team 6 coming in the dead of the night, shooting somebody and leaving, I don't see that much difference. But if you're talking about an ODA going out there and living with the people and making decisions and still killing people, but being there, talking to people, working with them, trying to help them solve their own problems, and that's a completely different animal. And I think, as I briefly alluded to in my response, I think that's a better way to handle this morally and practically, strategically, than using either drone strikes or raids in the dark of the night.
I don't have a lot to add since I'm not competent about a lot of things, but I guess I would say this, that there's a certain temptation to think that, well, it's more morally pure if we put our own lives on the line. And I think that part just doesn't make a whole, I can understand people who feel that way, but I wouldn't want to be one of the people whose lives were put on the line just in order to let people feel better. So that part of the argument, I guess I would reject.
Great point. Okay, young lady.
Hi, I'm Kaylin Burby. I'm from the University of Vermont ROTC program. And I think the preventive war, in a way, has the theory of guilty until proven innocent. And in that way, we could easily be thrust into a perpetual war. And with that perpetual war, it may desensitize the American population to war. And then adding in drone warfare, it kind of creates a sterile war where we don't have the deaths. So then there's not really the repercussions as much as seeing wounded troops, dead, killed in combat. And I agree that we need to suppress the threat of terrorists, but do you think that we will ever be able to exit this positive feedback loop of terrorist hunting? And also, I really like your point about the veil of secrecy between the Army and pretty much everyone else. And with the people in these countries that were attacking terrorists, with drones, they don't have a face to put on the Americans. They only know that we are killing people there. And if they have no one to contact, no one to ask questions or give feedback, it seems like there would be a never-ending loop, and then the trust would be lost between those countries with the people who want democracy and want our help. There would be no face to put when it's just drone strikes in the night. So my question
Can you repeat the question? It got lost in the sauce.
My question overall is, do you think that this would ever be able to end, this constant loop of terrorist hunting?
Well, I'm hoping. I don't know. I think that, I think you kind of summed it up pretty well. Stanley McChrystal, General McChrystal said, it might seem painless to us, but it's not painless to them. Mm-hmm. And I do think that I like your word sterile. I think the idea that this is just so much at a distance does. One thing though to add in here is that they've done some studies of the servicemen and women who actually launch the drone strikes and who can actually see their targets. And who knows if this is, I don't know how many studies there are, but the ones we've been given, is that it isn't painless. And that killing in and of itself has its own harm. And so I just want to put that out there. So it's got its own casualties.
Ian or Dr. Bush, anything?
You need to study it. We don't know enough about it. We've been practicing how to completely annihilate an enemy for thousands of years. And it's true that we've done counterinsurgency for thousands of years. I think this is new, isn't true. But the degree of focus that we put on it up till now has been relatively minimal. If you look at, for example, you go into political science and you look at the literature that we have on wholesale warfare, conventional warfare, it's pretty robust and it's pretty good. And if you look at the literature on counterinsurgency / disordered anarchical communities, it's a lot shallower and it's not nearly as good. So there's a role there for scholarship.
Questions? Mitch?
Yes.
I meant the cadet, sorry, cadet back there, sir, because we got your last one, we're trying to switch over.
This is a question for Dr. Greenberg. You say that there has been no discussion on the federal authority for drone strikes, only on the federal authority to drone strike American citizens. I wonder if this is true, or if at least the federal government has dropped hints in other discussions at what it considers to be its authority for conducting drone operations writ large, specifically for the purpose of targeted killing. I think of two specific instances. First, the discussion by Leon Panetta when he was head of the CIA following the strike against Osama bin Laden with regard to how Title 10, Title 50 distinctions governed what we did. And perhaps that we use Title 50 to justify all of our drone operations, specifically in areas of operation outside of Afghanistan and Iraq. That is not hot areas like Yemen, Somalia that we were talking about earlier with Professor Luban. And secondly, in May of 2013, when Obama himself, not the head of the CIA, talked about his plans, or at least his possible intentions, which have yet to come to fruition, for shifting all drone operations from the Central Intelligence Agency to the DoD. Does that not, to you, indicate sufficiently that the administration considers its drone authority to fall under Title 50, which is that sort of like hybrid JSOC CIA provision for doing things secretly and keeping all justifications a secret? And if so, do you think that a switch from Title 50 to Title 10, or something that would operate in a similar manner, maybe simply switching all drone operations from the CIA to the DoD, do you think that would be sufficient to rein the drone program in so that we don't have this perpetual war and solidify the Department of Defense as the primary actor in war from the United States?
Yeah. Again, great question.
Use the microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. Really, really great question. Yeah, it was interesting that President Obama mentioned that he wanted to move it from the intelligence, from CIA to the Pentagon, and then it sort of fell apart. Kind of like bringing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed into federal court and then finding out that they couldn't do that. To me, it was like what they wanted, but what they couldn't do. Why they couldn't do it, I don't know. Would it satisfy? Do I think it's a move in the right direction? Yes. But you're going to get, you know, the way I understand it, it's not just a turf battle. It's also a battle of, and maybe this is the turf battle, but of course the intelligence agencies are convinced that they know better how to do this, and that there's a downside to not being in on it. Now, a couple of journalists have referred to what you call this hybrid, but there's another dimension of the hybrid, which is using Title 50 authority for part of it and then switching to Title 10 and then coming back to Title 50 and Title 10. And I think that's kind of what we have and what we're going to keep. But to your answer, would that be a move in the right direction? Yeah, but if you have to convince people responsible for preventing another attack that that is workable and will keep the country safe, and that's a harder argument to make than you might think. So, yeah.
Next question, sir.
Major Fishback asked for statistics, thinking that's the way to decide whether drones work. On March 19th, 2003, we were going, Feast of St. Joseph, my patron, we were going to invade on the ground Iraq. But we wouldn't get the 50 Iraqis on the deck of cards if we simply sent attacks from Kuwait. So we used the equivalent of drones, cruise missiles, I think mostly from naval ships, against the 50 Iraqis on the deck of cards. Those missiles all hit their targets. None of the 50 were killed. Over 100 innocent civilians were killed. So that tells you something about the effectiveness, statistically speaking, of drone strike.
Did you have a question?
Comments, I'd like to hear. Thanks.
I agree with that, except I've seen drone strikes work fairly frequently. And my main point is that the numbers that we have are unreliable, and the scholarship on this type of venture is just underdeveloped. What you have is, because you have a veil of secrecy, people just make stuff up. And then you're left with someone going, it works, and someone else going, it doesn't work. And there's nobody who can verify anything. There's a scholar working at Villanova can't say, oh, well, let me see the data. And so my point isn't that you're right or wrong. My point is we just don't know. And I'd also say be careful that just because it doesn't work once doesn't mean it doesn't always work. Like Professor Levan said earlier, it's about risk. And the mere fact that, as a matter of fact, you got it wrong once or twice does not entail that you shouldn't have done it.
Questions? Sir in the back. You.
Thank you. I was very sympathetic to the main arguments of Professor Greenberg's talk, but also very sympathetic to Major Fishback's concerns about the veil of secrecy and the desirability of greater transparency, both with regard to public conversations here and with regard to the populations of places where drone strikes are taking place. It occurred to me, though, and I was worried there might be a tension between the arguments we were making, because it seemed to me that the the thrust to increase transparency might, though it wouldn't necessarily be its intention, have the effect of furthering the entrenchment in law of these policies. Because it seems that if more information is going to be given, more legal cover will be desired by those people giving it. Does that seem like a legitimate concern? I guess is my question.
It's a good concern. There's another piece of this. There was a whole part of this on secrecy that I didn't mention. One of the things about secrecy that's so bizarre is the law does not make it more transparent, having it in law. So, and this is a concern, but it might come from the fact that I'm going to refer to may come from that uncomfortable spot you're talking about. The FISA court is a secret court. It remains a secret court. We may know its decisions, we may not. We might know them 2 years later, we may never know them, all right? It makes its decisions in secret. It issues its orders in secret. There has been a call for a secret drone court along the lines of a FISA court. There has also been a call for a national security court, again, modeled on the FISA court, by which I mean to say, the fact that it's law does not mean that it is open and transparent. It may also be lawful and secret, which doesn't exactly, turn against your question, but just explains it. They are not mutually exclusive trajectories, if that makes sense to you.
It certainly makes sense. I guess that my concern was that while it's certainly the case that you can have law without having publicity, my concern was that you might not be able to have the thrust for publicity without generating law.
That may be a sad fact. That might be the case. But you could also have publicity and not get law, like in the case of enhancing interrogation. That got revealed and became public, and the legal documents that had authorized it were revoked. So, I mean, part of my premise is that we didn't have to keep these laws. We chose to keep these laws. And to your point about, what if we just switch course at some point, I 100% agree with that. After 18 months, pick whatever date you want. After 18 months after 9/11, when the United States understood what its capabilities were, was out of shock, which I think was serious on all levels, could have turned around and said, whoa, that was a mistake. We're going to just pull back here. But once, for whatever reasons, and political scientists are supposed to understand this, political theorists, but for whatever reason, the
system's not working.
It's just, it's not, where is the academy when we need it? I mean, seriously. The takeaway, the lesson is, real fundamental lesson is, once you start it, it is so profoundly difficult to stop it. And I don't understand the reasons, but I defer it to my law student.
Well, it does seem to me that this is pointing to the need to understand better what makes a good law about terrorism, because I did notice the tension that, on the one hand, in your paper and in your talk, laws were somehow part of the problem. They merely codify some of these difficulties, or give a kind of cover, a seeming legitimacy to policies that should not go on and should be revisited. On the other hand, what you call for in the end is that it needs to be more legal. But you say it needs to be more, this greater legality needs to come in the wake of a thorough rethinking of what kind of war are we conducting, what really is wise here. And so it does seem to make sense, but I think part of that rethinking does need to be what makes a good law about terrorism.
So, this thing about the pragmatism part, you're exactly right. And I did pull back at the end from where I think I might have gone. But one of the reasons was that what really started to become clear at the end, and this is why the killing of Alaki, it's not just about killing an American citizen. It's not just about trespassing over a whole host of constitutional rights, and it's not about using drones to kill American citizens, as was raised in Congress. The real issue is using drones for law enforcement. that was the issue, and that's sort of, when you talk about the pragmatism, I'm so worried about what could happen with this, that instead of using our legal system, which has now just become a nice little pet that we pat on the head and get what we want out of it, that it's deferred. This has been law in the service of war. So what more could be law in the service of war? Is, we got the criminal, you take care of it. And so that's why, as far as I know, that's why I pulled back, but you're absolutely right. I did. I had a completely different ending, which I took out.
I'm glad the Academy has been at least somewhat vindicated.
We've got time for a couple more. Harris, get you in here.
So what you said is absolutely correct. Transparency is not enough, but it's a prerequisite. That would be my response. Thank you.
Benjamin Harris.
Morning, ma'am. Morning, Jim. I'm Benjamin Harris from Villanova and ROTC. And my question is for all three of you, actually, but it's mainly to point out something that Dr. Bush spoke of at the very end. You said you must live with the choices you've made and be haunted by them, possibly, and that you kind of just have to live with that, and that might not change. And my issue with that, and my question is, shouldn't war be based on what we can live with? In our naval leadership and ethics course, what we're learning is that you have to make a choice that you personally can live with, and it's also about what the public can live with. So the whole public transparency that Major Fishback was talking about, I think is very important and a big part of what the general public is morally all right with or okay with. And I think for all three of you, my question is, shouldn't that be what the whole point of transparency is to see what the public thinks, since the government is founded based on the will of the people?
I'm glad to see he's been paying attention in class.
Well, thank you for that. I think I would say that one doesn't have to be Machiavellian in order to think that a certain kind of flexibility under circumstances is needed, and that it's very hard to draw limits around what it might be necessary to do, including practices of secrecy. It's not just Machiavelli who thinks this. Someone like Aristotle would agree very much also. But so regarding things like transparency and getting the consent of the people, have as much of it as possible. But one will find that from time to time, genuine emergencies do arise, and it's hard to know immediately even how big of an emergency it is. So in my written responses to Dr. Greenberg's paper, this makes political theorists like me think of Carl Schmitt and his evisceration of the Weimar Republic's legal system on a theoretical level. And nothing could be more horrible than this kind of radical starting point for demolishing liberal rights and the moral principles that one should have in life. But to say, no, you can never respond to circumstances and do very extreme things, I think that is something that is on people's lips, but when push comes to shove, we can't quite live by that. We have to be able to act. The problem is the things that we do under those extreme circumstances, sometimes they'll just be wrong, sometimes they'll be horrible, or sometimes they'll be things that were necessary in the moment, but we draw back from horror afterwards. And the sooner we can draw back, the better. It's not something that one can have a clear, coherent policy that angels can dance around. So I think that's my response.
Another question. Sir.
Professor Greenberg, I want to go back to the way that you originally defined the remarks, which was, I think, an extended reflection on the way in which the meaning of war seems to expand. And I'm reminded that the conviction that this country has been in permanent war first appeared in the 1940s. And so I'm wondering if a lot of what's been going on in the war on terror actually doesn't so much mark something that's new or unprecedented, as much as it marks maybe a culmination of certain things that have been going on in U.S. foreign and military policy since 1945. The creation and expansion of military and surveillance institutions. This is nothing. the moral and ethical cast of the antagonism. This is the way we fought the Cold War, right? The combination of overt warfare and clandestine operations, and again, nothing new. Remaking non-Western societies after our own image, nothing new. So, and all of this, you know, in some sense, it's not so much codified, but it's kind of crystallized in the Truman Doctrine. So what I'm wondering is if, in fact, there's actually a great deal more continuity between 9/10 and 9/11. Doesn't this suggest that, in fact, it is going to be even more difficult than we imagined to turn back from a lot of this? And doesn't this suggest that, in fact, the war on terror is actually, at the same time that it's supposedly been about security, it's actually been about maintenance of a certain kind of imperial unity?
Yes.
I guess we're done.
Okay, let me just absorb that. So there are two views of this. One is that tie to the 9/11 moment. One that many people who read my stuff always say to me is, why don't you blame Cheney and the others more, because they represented a long tradition in the United States that was imperialist, remaking the world in its image, part of the military-industrial complex in rapacious ways, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, using the rhetoric of American democracy for what they saw as their own ends and the way the country wanted to go. That's part of that same thing. And I guess you can tell it that way. And I don't know if it's my lack of intellectual capacity that keeps me from telling it that way, or a profound optimism that would like to think that this could be turned in another direction. And whatever you want to say about the decades-long or century-long march of America to become this imperialist, dominant, unethical, a global power, there have also been periods of time where it didn't look like that. And it didn't look like that overtly. And I guess this is where I come back to my covert, overt, and I yes, what you say is true. Yes, that was true in a lot of hot wars. But the real strain that connected what you're talking about was the covert world that took care of those things. And that's what's made it real. What I see is happening now is that those two worlds have collided right in front of our eyes. We don't even care anymore that it's covert. Not that I'm saying it was, we don't care. You want to torture people, you want to put them in a definite, we want to go into the targeted assassination, but we won't use the word assassination, go right ahead. We don't say we took it out of the CIA playbook and now we put it in congressional playbook. We don't go there. So I guess my wanting to say 9/11 is different is, in that way, to me, it is different. It's basically owning up to the past you're talking about. And that's good in the sense that, again, the optimist, but once you own up to it, then you can say, you can't hide behind your dinner table and say, no, that's not really who we are. Oh, don't say those things about who we are. Oh, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. What are you talking about? So my answer to you is yes, you're absolutely right. But it can't be that just because it's said like that, we have to accept it. And so a way to not accept it is to say, this is the moment that's made us look in the mirror at who we are, what we are, and now how we've institutionalized it in transparent ways, in increasingly transparent ways, and maybe we should do something about it. So, but still, yes.
I think we got time for one more question. Chicken Mobit.
Thanks, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am, gentlemen. So my question was on surveillance, and you're talking about a lot about the FISA, Patriot Act. I want to know what was your opinion if government should totally get rid of its surveillance, or what would you have as like an ethical or proper framework for the government's its surveillance of suspected terrorists here and abroad?
You have the rest of the afternoon? The answer to that. Number one, there is a distinction, I mean, I'm just going to get very specific here. There's a distinction between trawling and targeting. There's a difference between suspecting somebody because they've done something wrong and listening in to people who are Muslims, just to pick a group, and thinking, let's hear what they say to each other and see if we should follow them or get involved with them or go to meet them or whatever it is. That is a #1 fact of what the Fourth Amendment is supposed to protect against. That's why we had the probable cause standard. So that would be the first thing. #2, I don't like secret courts. I don't care if the FISA court's been there for 30 years, and there's a very famous federal court judge who is now retired circuit court judge, but who is extremely conservative, as conservative as they come, a good friend of Scalia and Cheney is usually how he's referred to, who went to Congress in 1978 and said, don't do this. Do not establish a secret court for foreign intelligence. This is a road a democracy cannot go down. You have no idea what the fallout of this will be. So #2, I don't believe in the entire court system, judicial proceeding, as a secret proceeding for what that means. The federal courts have learned how to handle classified information in terrorism case, after terrorism case, in a national security case, spies, etc., after national security case. Why can they not come up with a system that involves a court that is not secret, that has exceptions for classifications and classified material? So those are just two things of how I would think about it. And then, I mean, I could go on forever, but I'll leave it at that for now.
I'd like to also add that there's, at least there used to be, and this has come up several times, there used to be a big distinction between at home and abroad. And I agree with everything Karen said, but I'd also add that Special Forces, it was a big deal whether you were under Title 10 or Title 50. And you didn't just bounce back and forth, right? You didn't go, oh, today I'm under Title 10 and tomorrow I'm under Title 50. The FBI and the CIA were distinct for a reason. You might think it even went too far to even have those organizations, whatever. They were distinct for a reason. And the difference after 9/11 is that all that's just been blend together. There's no, it's almost like nobody even thinks about it or brings it up that, hey, we used to think that at a minimum we were going to protect our liberal institutions at home. And yeah, maybe we'll be tyrants abroad, and I would agree that that's wrong. But everybody agreed that you didn't do that at home. That was just all going to blend together.
It's not just the DOJ and the DOD, but it's the whole of government. It's everything that's been combined. It's not simply those possibly war-fighting elements, but it's everything that's been blended.
I'd like to thank Dr. Greenberg, Dr. Bush, and